Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Shavua Tov. We're going to be talking today about intention, about setting intention. So I want to begin by setting an intention for our learning today, which on the one hand will have nothing to do with what's going on in the world, but I want to begin by setting an intention that our learning contribute to the healing of this nation by making us wiser and more compassionate people. And that as we study this tradition, which is grounded in a story of suffering, that we be more alert to the suffering of people in our city, in our nation, and all over the world. That practice of setting an intention for learning is on the one hand classic. It really takes off in the Kabbalistic period, where you'll find, and we just finished the mitzvah of counting the Omer, and before that counting between Passover and Shavuot, there's all kinds of Kabbalistic flourish around it that has us setting an intention to unify the God itself, right? To like unify different God with God's Shekhinah. And so there's another example of an intention. We're going to be looking at actually a huge, just a massive concept in Jewish practice, certainly in Jewish prayer, but in Jewish practice and mitzvot altogether, which is kavanah, intention. You've probably heard the word kavanah before. We'll talk a little bit about what that is, but there's a debate in the Talmud over whether mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Do mitzvot require intention? Do these commandments, do the performance of the commandments require intention? So before we get into the text, let me just ask you, what does that mean? What is that question about? Do mitzvot require intent? What would it mean for mitzvot to require intention? So let's just think about that a sec before we dive in. Anyone? I'll give us a few seconds to sort of take that in. What would it mean for mitzvot, for these commandments, for it to be important, not just important, but actually requisite that we have intention? Wendy, I saw you had a hand.
I think it's the essential mindfulness of everything that we do, that it's not without thought, that everything comes in a very from a very aware state.
Great. That's a great word, and especially because it has such currency in our culture at this moment, mindfulness, right? Sort of borrowed from Buddhism, secularized, but mindfulness. Now, I might have to ask you to define what mindfulness is, but we have some sense of it, and okay, that's one word we can use. Other contributions, Pam?
It raises the question of, is it okay to just go through the motions?
It does. Can you say one more sentence about that?
So, doing the right thing as it's written is one thing, but well, it goes back to the mindfulness. Like if you're just doing the act of lighting the candles or whatever other blessing, but you don't somehow connect to its holiness or use it as a tool to separate the weak, or incorporate it in some way, or elevate it in some way, or do something with that act, or bring an awareness to that act. Is it just an empty act? Great.
Okay. So if mindfulness is on one end, then sort of rote mindlessness is on the other. And this formula that mitzvot tzrichot kavanah would then mean that if you were just going through the motions, if you weren't really present in the mitzvah, it wouldn't count, which is quite a radical thing to say. All right, I'm gonna take a couple more comments. I saw Payam and Nick, and then we're gonna plow a little bit forward. I think I see Beryl.
I have a different view on this. Isn't it that it's
Payam,
whether...
how come I never get to see you? I want to see you, Payam.
Okay, I'll do it next one. I'll do it but it's does mitzvot have to precede? I mean, does kavanah have to precede mitzvot? It's not necessarily require. It's what comes first. Can you do the mitzvot before you have the kavanah, and then mitzvot leads to the kavanah. It's not necessarily requires the right word. It's the order of kavanah and mitzvot.
Okay, this is great. You're taking us into a really important, but thank you for grasping the subtlety there. It's easy to miss distinction between what I did at the outset of this class, which is to set an intention, or what the Kabbalists might do in a more mystical way to set an intention, and then just go ahead and do the mitzvah. It's beforehand. Or more like, I think what Wendy and Pam were saying, is it during the mitzvah? I have to be, while I'm doing it, I have to be intentional about it. Those are two ways of thinking of, and as Pam saying, one is more sequential. Okay. Nick.
And then there's the other part of the conversation of like, well, what type of mitzvah are we talking about? Is it like giving tzedakah, which is what's more important, that we are doing it for all the right reasons, or that the people who need the tzedakah are getting it? You know, I think I think if we arrest ourselves with our sort of our intentions, sometimes we can run the risk of keeping ourselves from actually doing the good that we're required to do.
Good. Okay. That does a great spin on it, an important one. Do they require good intention? Do they require the right intention? Is there a correct intention? If I call you up to the Torah because I know you get nervous in public and stumble over brachot, and I want to humiliate you because you humiliated me at dinner last night, is that, I have intention, does that invalid, like, is that the wrong intent? Do I have to call you up to the Torah for the right reason? That's actually, I'm not sure that's a great example because the calling is not the mitzvah, but doing a mitzvah for let's say I read from the Torah so that you think I'm awesome and skillful. Is that a correct intention? Right? Okay. Great. Yeah. Great question to introduce there, Nick. Beryl.
It's sort of piggybacking, but the question of like quantity over quality, we have so many mitzvot that we're obligated to do every single day. And I mean, do we only have, is there a quota of intention that you have to allocate to things? And if so, like, are we allowed to do less if it quote unquote means more?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think part of what you're asking us to consider is, well, just how much intention can we really have? I mean, how mindful do you, and this is the part of the debate that the Talmud takes up. How mindful do you have to be? You have to be mindful in every moment? I mean, you know, can't I go about my good deeds and then start thinking about something? I'm still doing it, aren't I? I mean, yeah, okay. So this is it. To say that all of my ritual life would require like perfect and honed attention, yeah, that's saying a lot. Okay, I see some more hands up, but I'm gonna take us into the text a little bit, and then I just note that Ruth and Wendy have their hands up, so I'll prioritize you as we come to it. Let me share a source sheet with you all. We are in that's in the chat there. We're in I'll just remind you what the intention I set last time, which was that we're going to move through the Mishnah in order, but only looking at the highlights, right? So not just scattered across the Mishnah for the good stuff. We are going to move in order, but we're not going to look at every single Mishnah because some are just more noteworthy and important than others. And this is a huge one. If you've been following us for the last couple classes, we've been at the beginning of the 6 orders of the Mishnah, and the first order of the Mishnah, the first series, is the laws of seeds, they call it, which means agricultural law, but it begins with the laws of blessings, and we talked a little bit about why that might be, and as we're talking about blessings, right? Make blessings over food. So maybe that's the connection. Lots of possible we start talking about prayer, right? And that also, maybe that's, you need to pray if you're a farmer in order to, you know, so we talked about that, but we were talking about prayer, and we actually begin with the Shema, right? The Mishnah begins with the question, Me'ematai korin et hashma. When do you recite the Shema? In the evening. When do you do it? What time? What's the timing? Right? And then it starts talking about all these different ways that that situated us in reciting the Shema? Do we, like, based on the words of the Shema, do we have to say it while seated, standing, walking, day, night? And then we talked a little bit about the Shema itself. What do we say? And what are the blessings that go in there, okay? With that, that was the first chapter of Brachot. And with that, we open the second chapter with what is really going to become a very key phrase in just Jewish law, Jewish prayer, Jewish practice altogether, which is this phrase right here, im kiven libo, if one directs one's heart. You may have saw, I posted this class, I called it Heart Directions, because so far we've been talking about intention, but the word for intention is kavanah in Hebrew, and the word kavanah means direction, literally. And in fact, the common phrase for intention is kavanat lev, the directing of the heart, right? Okay, so see how it comes out here. Okay, if one was reading in the Torah out loud, right? You got a Torah open, as you do. Torah scrolls open, you're reading through it, and the time for reciting the Shema arrives. So the presumption here, sort of between the lines, but the presumption is you're reading in the Torah right where the Shema is. That is in the book of Deuteronomy, where it actually says Shema Yisrael. But we've spent all this time saying, well, you have to do it in the evening. Well, what if you're reading along in the Torah and you get to the Shema, and you know what? It's time to recite the Shema. So then it's the Mishnah says, im kiven libo, if one directs one's heart. And here's another, there are really two huge phrases that are kind of introduced here. One is Yatsa, and I'll just explain that quickly. The phrasing that the rabbis use to describe successful performance of mitzvot is Yatsa, or goes out, and literally it means goes out from obligation. That's I want to give us all that reference because it may affect how we interpret the rest of the Mishnah, but it may not. It may just be important to note that the way the rabbis talked about fulfilling obligation, they didn't use the word fulfill, they used the word leaving, as if you had like an obligation kind of placed around you, and you had to escape that obligation. Like once you perform the mitzvah, you yatsa yidei chova, you leave your obligation. So interesting phrasing. It'll become, pretty common in the Mishnah, so it's good to know. But more important for our purposes today is this phrase right here, im ki. Oh, every time I have to like figure out how to do this without, maybe later. Okay. Im kiven libo yatsa. If ve'im lav lo yatsa. So if one directs one's heart, one goes out from one's obligation, but if not, one does not go out. So let's think now. Now we have it in context. What does that mean? What does that seem to mean here? If you're reading in a Torah book, a Torah scroll, and you come to Shema, and it's time to recite Shema, then you have to direct your heart, and you can and it'll count. But if you don't direct your heart, it won't count. So what does that look like? Anyone want to just explain that for us? What would that mean?
I can try.
Yeah, go for it.
So if you just are in the middle of a service and you're kind of like going through the motions and not really paying attention, and you just kind of like read it straight, it doesn't count. But if you're in services and you're kind of like coming in and out of it, and then you arrive at the Shema, and it's kind of like a wake-up moment for you, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, no, actually I'm going to think about what I'm actually saying when I come together in community and cover my eyes and make this statement, then that does count. Okay,
so now that's very helpful, but you did two very distinct things, and one was a claim. One was an explanation, one was a claim. The explanation was that there you might be mindless as you're reading through. You have to be mindful, right? You just sort of, you're daydreaming, you're in a daze, and no, that's not going to work. You can't be thinking about something else and fulfill the mitzvah of Shema. But then the question is, well, what does it mean then how do you have to direct your heart? And you gave us a version of it, which is a perfectly reasonable version. maybe the obvious one, which is think about the words you're saying. Make sure, think about you actually added some more stuff like, and I'm here in this congregation and I'm fulfilled. Like you actually added a lot of kavanot, but I want to highlight the first, because one version of kavanah would be when you say the Shema, think about what the Shema means. And so then you have to ask, well, what would that mean about for blowing the shofar? Right, and I don't know, Allison, what would you say? Maybe it's think about what the shofar means. They're not words anymore, but always think about the purpose of the mitzvah. That would be one answer. All right, let me just return to folks who have had their hands up. Ruth, are you still? I don't see Ruth. Okay, Wendy. Oh, I see you Ruth now, but I'll come to you, Ruth.
Yes. For instance, my most frequent bracha is when I go to take a drink of water. Okay? And sometimes I'm just so thirsty, I pick it up and I may say it in my head as I'm actually drinking the water. And other times I'm really there and I'm mindful and I'm grateful for the water and I say it and I'm connecting with you, God. It's a way of saying I'm connecting with you, God.
Okay, perfect example. And then you also, like Allison, you jumped and made a strong claim, which is great. This is another verse. Perfect example. The blessing shehakol niyeh bidvaro. Like Ruth, it's the one I'm saying most often. Right? It's just because of the nature of our food blessings. There's a catch-all blessing that everything was created with God's word. You say for a fruit, you say a particular blessing. For bread, you say a particular blessing. But for most things, you say Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh bidvaro. And I say it so often that it's like there's no way I'm like, God made everything with God's word. No, I'm just like it becomes, it's a part of me, right? So sometimes I'm in that, or Ruth says sometimes, and this is another version of kavanah, Ruth is connecting to God. That's very different than knowing what the mitzvah is about. Have an intention to use this mitzvah as a spiritual opportunity to connect to God. That's big. Okay, Wendy?
There are a few things that come to mind. One of the things was from Mishpatim. We're talking about mitzvot. Mitzvot are things that we do. And we are people who are, as my husband said, we're doers. We're doers. So we do, and then we shall hear. And which is also brings me then to another notion that oftentimes my mother used to say, act as if, and you will become. So when you do, in the action of doing, you may not even be there, but as you do it, that can bring you to that place that maybe the kavanah should have been in the first place. So it can be almost a circular sort of thing. One can feed the other. And then the other thing, we've been talking about this. I think when I think of kavanah, I don't think of as much of an intellectual process as one, it's, as you're saying, from the heart, something that is felt deeply. Kavanah is not something that I just put my mind to. It is my whole being is in this, my intellect and my neshama, all of it. That is kavanah.
Okay, good. Wendy is giving us the fullness of the phrase to direct one's heart, because it is true that the heart in biblical Hebrew, in rabbinic Hebrew as well, is not just the heart, it's like the consciousness, the heart mind, right? It's all the same. They very rarely use the word brain or moach, except in a kind of technical sense. The heart is the consciousness. So the whole, that includes feeling and thinking and all that. So yes, so that's important too. And you took us to another place, which is to suggest that you could, so far we've been considering the virtues or the value of intention, but you just considered the value of not having intention, right? Which is maybe it's important to allow for the performance of mitzvot without intention, because eventually, if you do that, you will come to have intention, right? And there's a famous phrase in the Talmud that says that you should do mitzvot lishma. Oseh mitzvot lishma bali shelo lishma bali de mitzvot lishma. If you do these mitzvot, this is not the same phrase, but you don't do them for their, for the sake that they were intended. You just sort of doing them thoughtlessly. Eventually, you'll end up doing them. So there might be, that was not a very clear way of saying it. You said it clearer, which is to say there might be a whole realm of doing mitzvot that is just important just to keep us in the rhythm. Okay, Hannah.
Yeah, this is somewhat related to actually what you and Wendy are saying, but I've been thinking a lot about when God gives us the Torah, people say, Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do it and then we'll understand. And there are a lot of different ways of understanding that phrase, and I've heard a lot of people understand it differently, but I've always thought about it as this command to, like, sometimes you just have to do stuff, and not because you feel great about it or it's really exciting or you have this deeper meaning, but this idea that you just have to do it. And so I don't have an answer to anything. I'm just thinking about that in this context of, so what does intention mean? Is the intention just, this is what we do as Jews and that's an intention, and so that goes for saying the Shema or saying a bracha or whatever else? Or does the intention have to be like, I'm doing this for the purpose of the Shema, which means this thing for me in this moment? Like, what does it mean? Because sometimes you just need to do stuff. And the other example of that I think about is, I work in recovery, and one of the things that we talk about in 12 Steps a lot is you can't think yourself into right action. You have to act yourself into right thinking. And what does it mean that sometimes you just have to do stuff and your mind isn't in the right place, but it doesn't always matter?
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking while you were suggesting to us, I think very wisely, that that it may be difficult, unreasonable even, to imagine that someone always has the correct intent. I was just thinking, we're talking about the Shema here. Like, we're talking about the unity of God. Like, what does that mean? How am I supposed to have correct intention around God's oneness? I understand that, so isn't that whole idea, I can't possibly fathom God? So, like, what would it, or is it just a simpler version? Like, I'm saying the Shema. Yeah. Let's see. I have two participants who have raised hands, and they're both Alexandra Goldman. Hi. You somehow have two screens, I think. Okay. Alexandra.
Well, unfortunately, there's only one of me. So I guess I have a question and a comment. And my question is, was this written before the rabbis added into the Shema that sentence, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Le'olam Va, or whatever is that the right sentence? I always skip it. Was this written before they separated the God is one and you shall love God, or was this written after they separated that?
The answer is before. They're working it out. That's what, in some ways, this chapter is up to. But yes, why do you ask?
I ask because I personally take it out, because what it does for me for being there, because it's not there in the Torah, but I actually use the Shema to direct my heart, because like when I feel like I want to be more loving or like feel safe or whatever, like it's from like an exercise in loving the unity of God. So wherever I want to send more love to me or to someone I'm pissed off at or to somewhere I feel unsafe, like it helps me to direct my heart. And that is like, that's sort of how I use it. I don't like when I forget to say it when my heart is full, but like when I need it, I think I go to it and focus, and I take out that sentence and I just put the God is one and you shall love God. And like with the Hasidic idea that like everything is God and we're all one, etc. And like everything is love. So that's how I use it. And it helps me to direct my heart.
Okay, great. Great. I mean, there's a lot in what you're saying. First of all, it's striking that you're talking about the intentions that work for you, which is great. But you've chosen intentions that speak to what you need from this mitzvah, or what you want, or what you're looking for, right? That's interesting, and it's a different paradigm than the correct intention, or the intention just to be doing the mitzvah as it is. So that's interesting, and it's also interesting that the place that it took you to is beginning to select which parts of it work better for you or not. So now this is I think this is an important thing to notice, because as we head into the realm of intention, we've already addressed certain problems. It sounds so nice at first to say, yeah, of course, intention, they should all have intention. But we've addressed already certain problems with intention, like how could you possibly summon all that intention, right? How could you summon the correct intention? So, but now here's another potential challenge that comes in the realm of intention, which is that if you have to summon intention, and that's after all an internal experience, won't you have to craft your performance of mitzvot around the summoning of that intention? And maybe the intention will take priority over the mitzvot themselves. Like you'll do some, not others, you'll reshape it. Like, is that okay? Like, do the mitzvot now match the intention? Right, so we're in complicated territory here. Okay, I want to take us just a little bit forward. I see Ruth, Ruth, I see you've got your hand raised again. Are you with us? Is this from before, or Ruth, are you raising your hand now or from before? Oh no. Here, I'm gonna unmute you. Hold on. Jess, I don't think you've made, I can't unmute Ruth.
I can't either for some strange reason. It's only asked to unmute. So Ruth, I'm very sorry. If you want to write in the chat your question, we will certainly hear it.
I don't know why you can't unmute, but we'll try. We'll come back.
I just didn't.
Oh, there you are. Okay, go for it. Ruth, I heard you. Okay. Here's we're gonna go back into the text, and I have to say I was going to take us through this whole Mishnah, which is very interesting, but I think given the nature of our conversation right now, I want to just keep us focused on this phrase, kavanah. Kiven libo. What exactly does that mean? The rest of the Mishnah is worth looking at. It discusses instances in which you might be allowed to disrupt your intention while saying the Shema. It's a fascinating discussion, but I think for our purposes, I want to plow forward a little bit and take us into the Talmud. So the Talmud, and many of you know this, is a composite of an earlier piece of rabbinic teaching called the Mishnah, which is what we're studying together, and then the commentary and discussion of the Mishnah, which is called the Gemara. Together they make up the Talmud, okay? So here is the opening gambit, the opening line in the Talmud right after this Mishnah. Given what we've said about if you have intention, you fulfill your obligation. If you don't, you don't. The Talmud asks, and look at how few words are in here, but there's a whole conversation. As I was translating this, I had I had Steinsaltz's translation in front of me, and it's like a big paragraph long, like it's a huge chunk where he's just trying to explain these very few words, because there's a lot going on in here. So the opening here in the Talmud is Shma Mina. You learn from this. And here's the big phrase, mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Mitzvot require intention. Mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. You learn from what we just said that mitzvot require intention. And take note now, we were talking about the Shema, but now we're in all mitzvot. All mitzvot require intention. Okay. But the Talmud is going to challenge that notion, as the Talmud does. My im kiven libo. What does it mean if one directs one's heart? What does that phrase mean? We've been trying to figure that out ourselves. So one possible answer that the Gemara offers is it means direct one's heart to reciting the Shema. likrot, right? This is the very short dialogue here. My im kiven libo, what does it mean if one directs one's heart? Likrot, direct your heart to reciting the Shema. That's one version that we have offered up. I am now reciting the Shema. I am reciting. Here I am reciting. I'm doing it. Shema's happening. Yep, it's the Shema. Okay, there you go. That's the intention. But the Talmud asks a very good question. Likrot? What do you mean? Kakari. What does it mean that you have to direct your heart to reciting? You are reciting the Shema. How can you, why do you need intention that you are doing something when you are doing it? I mean, of course, as many of you suggested, you can do something mindlessly. But if you're reading a book, it would be very hard to claim that you don't even know you're reading. Right? Like, oh my gosh, I just woke up and here I am. Is it really intentionless? Even if you're not fully tuned in to the mitzvah, isn't that like, shouldn't that be sufficient? So the Talmud answers, well, this applies to someone who is reading through to check for mistakes. Meaning, this whole teaching is meant for someone who might be reading through the Shema, but their intention is elsewhere. It's not recitation, it's checking for error. Okay. So let's talk about this a little bit. Now we have like a particular version of intention offered and then rejected, okay? What's the version of intention that the Talmud proposes? What, like, don't give me the words, but speak it out. What are they asking for? What's the kind of intention that seems to matter to the Talmud initially? Right? What does if one directs one's heart mean? It means directs one's heart to reciting. What does that mean? Tali? I don't hear you, Tom. Do we have a muting problem here? Maybe?
Yeah, sorry, y'all. Zoom just changed their whole grade. So all I can do, even as a host, is I can just click ask to unmute. So I will ask you, and now you're unmuted.
Okay. That could be, okay. Could be tricky. Tali, I think you're unmuted now.
Oh, you can hear me now? It's
Yep.
full, it's just what the Shabbat, with all your heart. It's to be fully present with all your heart, every aspect of you. So if you think Lavavka, it's even that the heart of you, the Yatsa that's going in the other direction, it's all of you at that moment to be fully there.
Okay, brilliant answer. Brucha shekivant, because that is exactly the kind of, that is exactly the source that the Talmud discusses for the very notion of intention. You shall say these words, b'chol levavcha, with all of your heart. So that's right, so there you go. You have to say it with all your heart. But I will say, Tali, that your version of with all of your heart is more than the Talmud is suggesting right now. To really be fully present in the mitzvah, that's another level. Okay. But the Talmud so far is, and you're right, the words of the Shema suggest the level you're talking about. But the Talmud is suggesting something far more modest, which is what, Pam?
It's just to be, to recite it, like to be aware that you're reciting it, but it's much more about the action than it is the depth of the intention. You're actively reciting it, you're aware that you're reciting it, but it's much more about the, I don't know, it's not suggesting the same level of presence. And it brings, this whole conversation brings to mind this kind of dichotomy of like, which is really more important in terms of developing ourselves spiritually? Is it the kavanah or the halakha? right? And there's this attempt of saying, well, they're both important. You've got to go through these acts, and there has to be a level of mindfulness when you go through those acts. And it sounds like the Kavanah is getting a little watered down here. It's like you've got to be present, and some of the other, I forgot who said it, but someone was describing, I think it was Hannah was describing her intentionality around the Shema, which was beautiful. And like, that sounds so much better to me than what the rabbis might have intended when they wrote this, that was trying to create like this middle ground kind of thing. Because I think the kavanah of the intentionality of this whole process is to really be to really be present and spiritually connected to God, right? And so sometimes not everyone can tap into that. So there's almost like this watering down thing of, you got to do it this way and be aware of what you're doing and be present with your doing. But it's directing your, here it says direct your heart to reciting.
Okay, that's great. I think you're right in two important ways. I think you're correctly understanding the kind of intention that they are calling for here, which is just intention that I am hereby performing the mitzvah. I am doing what the mitzvah requires of me. And I also think you're correct in a larger sense, and people have alluded to this earlier, that there's some big question that's hovering over all of this, which is whether action is more important or intention is more important. And we might, I think, often in contrast to Christianity, let's like not ignore that, the Jesus in the room. In contrast to Christianity, we tend to self-perceive that what's important to us is action. Jews care about what you do. It's not about faith. It's not about what's in your heart. It's in other words, I could pose this as a philosophical question, sort of a religious question for you all. Well, are actions the most important thing? And if they are the most important thing, does it really matter what's going on inside of us? Or is the emotional, intentional, cognitive experience, is that really the goal of it all? Right? So that's a huge, huge question. And Pam, as I think you're suggesting, maybe the reason that the rabbis are offering such a meager version of kavanah is because they're trying to resolve that tension. They don't think it makes sense to do the mitzvot mindlessly. But on the other hand, they don't want to say that it's all about getting to God or feeling the depth or all these deep, deep things, because that's not, first of all, that may not be possible. We've considered that. But it also, maybe that's not the religion. The religion is do stuff, do the right thing. Yeah, who cares what you think, right? That's a legitimate position, right? So, great. So I think you've given us a sense of what the intention of just recitation might be. Now, I want to also ask the question then, why is it that someone who's reading through just to correct for mistakes does not have the correct intention? Because that person is also reciting. I mean, that's not mindless either. What's happening there? Why is that not the correct intention? Okay, people have had their hand raised, so those who've had their hand raised don't have to answer that question, but collectively we have to. Nick, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I wanted to just throw an idea into the mix. There's this idea that I use from sort of the Stanislavski school and kind of also like Udhagen schools of acting, when we talk about like this idea of like scoring a scene. And basically what that means is creating a framework for all the actions within the scene, and having that sort of semi-set, and then thus creating a space for yourself to have some sort of structured spontaneity. And a teacher of mine described that as like building a lamp, and then you're the flame within the lamp, which is always different and always moves. And I tend to think of keva, as the liturgy, as the mitzvot, as everything that's sort of like formally prescribed as the lamp, and then the kavanah as the flame. You know what I mean? I think that there's also a conversation using ritual as a container for kavanah, or like there's this word that goes around of like it's a container for intention, So I think that it can always be there, whether our intention is the same or good or whatever. It's a means by which it's a set tool, so we're not just lost in kavanah world and sort of like philosophical ephemeral world.
Good. Good, thank you. Nick is fleshing out this tension that I just pointed to between action and inner experience with some of the language that that Abraham Joshua Heschel gave us in a famous essay where he talks about the tension between keva and kavanah, right? Which is not actually, that juxtaposition is not classical. It's like part of his alliterative ear to put those. But keva means regular, disciplined, attentive structure, right? And kavanah means intention. And as Heschel phrases it, there's a tension constantly in the mitzvot between having to do something, being disciplined about doing it on the one hand, and then really feeling it and being, and we've come across that tension, right? When we talked about this idea of really getting into my inner experience, as Alexandra was describing it, you can imagine how that, prioritizing that, would allow for the sort of like deprioritizing of keva, of just the structure, right? So that's another way of talking about what's important in the performance of mitzvot. Wendy?
You know, getting back to the Gemara, what was saying, I think when we're talking about the heart, that I got a sense that it's to direct one's heart to want to do this, to have a desire, not just to do them, not just to be aware, not just to be present with it, but to have a desire to do it, that one is passionate about mitzvot.
Okay, that's another level. We've got lots of, I don't know exactly whether, like, how to talk about it. Is it levels? But I am thinking of greater and greater degrees of focus or intention. One might be awareness that I'm doing the mitzvah. And another might be, I want to do this mitzvah well. And another might be, I want to do this to connect to God. And another might be, I want to feel the presence of God in my whole being. And another might be, I want to use this mitzvah to, as I said at the outset of this class, like, I hope that I set an intention that this Torah study makes us better people so that we do good in the world, right? So that we are more compassionate and just as we live in but that has nothing to do with the mitzvah, or does it? Am I allowed to put my own? So you can see like a very levels of intensity and simplicity, right? Like that are on some kind of spectrum where the most simple would just be, I'm doing it. But now I want to ask the question again. There is a more simple version that is not good enough for them, which is the version where you're not actually reciting the Shema per se, you're checking for mistakes. In other words, if you're reading a book out loud, Sefer Torah out loud, you didn't intend that you were saying the mitzvah, but you did intend that you were reciting the Shema, and that is the mitzvah, so it works. But if your intention is, I'm reading through here just to make sure there are no mistakes, that doesn't work. Why doesn't that work? You're still intending to do the thing that actually ends up being the Shema. Why doesn't that work, Hannah?
Well, I was thinking that sometimes if you're reading something specifically to correct something, you might not even notice you're at the Shema. Like, you're like, okay, these letters seem like they work together, or like this seems like it's in the right order, but if you're focused that much on, it's like you miss the forest through the trees, you know? I feel like you have to have some sense of at least where you are. And it's possible that if you're so hyper-focused on correcting, you may lose sight of what you're saying or what you're reading. Great.
That's a great explanation, right? If I'm like, take a look at the shape of the letters on this page. Just study the shape of the letters and how beautiful their curves are, right? Like, that's nice. Hebrew letters are beautiful. But if that's really what I may actually be so far removed that I'm not actually thinking about, I'm not even doing the basic act of reading. I'm actually just, in this case, looking for mistakes, exception, right? Okay, wonderful. Anyone else have a thought on these various levels and the level past which you have not summoned correct intention, this checking for mistakes level? Okay. I hear someone.
Okay.
Kathy, hi.
Hi. Can you hear me? It's actually very interesting. I don't know if any of you have done like serious proofreading, but I've heard from proofreaders, and I've done a little of this, is that sometimes the meaning of the text can get in the way of proofreading. Like you're reading through. And so that if you're really proofreading, like really proofreading for mistakes, sometimes you read backwards. I think.
Wow. I've never heard that, but that's great.
Yeah, because it's like as you're reading, your mind corrects mistakes because you make sense of things, you know, the way we can fill in. But if you're reading backwards, I think I'm not making this up.
Well,
you're not. It's a real thing.
I'm glad whether you're making it up or not, because it's perfect it's perfect if that were true, and let's presume it is. That's exactly right. That level of intention is exactly, that's the threshold. Once we've gotten to that level, we no longer fulfill our obligation. And you can imagine reciting the Shema backwards, right? Like, or you can imagine just looking at the beauty of the letters, or you can imagine just like checking to make sure this Torah scroll's not too faded, right? All of that stuff, as Kathy is saying, maybe we don't even want to be thinking about the Shema. Thinking about the Shema will get in the way. I'm just trying to do another thing, right? So far it seems we can have a very low level of intention. I don't know, very low level. Maybe it's actually quite a lot to just be present and say, hey, I am reciting the Shema. But that's enough. But less than that, where you're like, oh, it so happens I'm reciting the Shema while I check for mistakes, that's not enough, okay? So we've defined like one spectrum of intention. Now I want to shoot over and look at the other end of what it would mean to summon intention, which is not a general, I want to be present, not even a general, I want to connect and do this in the right way, but in the second Mishnah in chapter 2, we actually get what becomes the classic intention that you bring to the Shema, though whether it's required or not, I think we'll have to figure out. But take a look at the second Mishnah here. Second Mishnah discusses the breaks between the sections. So the Shema, as many of you know, is composed of 3 paragraphs, and it has the opening, the grand statement, Shema, Alexandra mentioned earlier. Then there's an insertion that that the rabbis put in of Baruch Shem Kavod, and then the first paragraph, second paragraph, third paragraph. There are 2 blessings before the Shema. There's a blessing after the Shema. So basically between each of these sections, there is a break. And in the part of the Mishnah we didn't look at, they talked a little bit about like, well, do you have to have intention during those breaks? We'll have to save that for another time. But take a look especially at this bolded passage here. Okay, so these are the breaks between the sections. Between the first blessing and the second, there's a break. Between the second and Shema itself, there's a break. Between Shema, the first paragraph, and Bahaya in Shemoah, the second paragraph, and this answers Alexandra's question earlier. They're not thinking about interruptions between the first paragraph of the Shema, that comes later. But then between the second paragraph, and it shall come to pass if you listen, and the third paragraph, and the Lord said, and then between and the Lord said and Emet v'Yatziv, which is the paragraph that picks up after the Shema. If this is sounding like a lot of information, don't worry about it. It's just describing the marking points at the beginning and end of all the paragraphs of the Shema. Rabbi Judah says, between and the Lord said and Emet v'Yatziv, one should not interrupt, which is our practice. We pause at the end of the Shema and then just keep going as soon as the Chazan is finished saying the Shema. But then there's this question, which takes us back into the realm of intention, though it doesn't use exactly the word intention. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha said, why is the section of Shema, meaning the first paragraph of the Shema, which speaks in a general way about reciting the Shema, placed before the second paragraph of the Shema, which speaks more about the performance of mitzvot? Okay, why have them in that order? And here's their famous answer. So that one should first accept upon oneself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, here's the phrase in Hebrew, Ela kedei sheyekabel alav ol malchut shamayim techila. Okay, when you recite the first paragraph of the Shema, you should be accepting upon yourself the yoke, the burden of the kingship of heaven. God is my king. The heavens are my king, whatever. I accept upon myself the sovereignty of the divine. That's what should be in your head. Now, talk about a kavanah. That's a huge kavanah. And by the way, who said that that's what the Shema is all about? Well, Rabbi Shua ben Korcha did, okay? But that becomes one way that we talk about reciting the Shema. The recitation of the Shema is the acceptance of the kingdom of heaven. And look at how he continues. And then take upon oneself the yoke of the commandments, which means the second paragraph has a different yoke, a different burden. Right? You may not like these intentions because they're all about like the heaviness of it all, the burden of it all. But whatever it is, this is the intention that he's proposing. First paragraph, think like, God is my king. I subject myself to God. Second paragraph, I subject myself to the mitzvot. Those are the intentions you should bring. Okay, now that's very different. That's very different. That is a specific kind of an intention of a specific idea that isn't even in the Shema, that the rabbis are telling me I should associate with the Shema, right? Okay, that's a huge, that's all the way on the other end. So we have a few minutes left, and having set up these polls, right? Mitzvot require intention. Do they require, on the one hand, a very specific intention of what is this mitzvah about, and get to that intention and think about it? Or way over on the other hand, do they just require the intention that I know I'm doing this? I'm not doing it completely mindlessly, right? So I guess I want to just turn to you in these last few minutes and ask you, well, what do you think? What would, if you were God, if you were the Torah, if you were the rabbis, what would you require? Would you require a little bit of intention? None at all? Full blown? Just a general spiritual experience? Like, which of the many versions of directing your heart do you propose? Do you recommend? And I ask you also to consider, the risks and the advantages and disadvantages. We've talked about some of the reasons why it's good not to have intention, not to require it, right? Payam.
Isn't the concept that like one mitzvah is fulfilling all the mitzvahs? I mean, there isn't really I know like in Pirkei Avot, there really isn't a delineation that much between the mitzvahs. So I think for the rabbis, it's having that main intention, even for the smallest one, is very important because they associate even the smallest mitzvot with all of the mitzvot. So I think, but I mean, like from a personal standpoint, I think it's an interesting concept of that way, but I think it's almost impossible to be that present in the world and like the smallest thing you do to equate to all of them. But I think that's my interpretation, the rabbinical interpretation of it, and why they're so strict on it.
Tali? I can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? I know. Are you stuck on muted? I'm sorry not to hear you.
Okay.
I hear you. Like that's what you have to do. You have to apologize to someone for it not working.
Right. I may be off on this, but I'm trying to look at it from an educational perspective, and I'm also looking at this as a very democratic perspective. Is that we all are in different stages, so it's like you're developing through. In the beginning, you may be only able to do it at the pashat, the most simplest level, but you're doing it. You've been doing it, and as time, like a spiritual practice, the more you do it, there's a hope. There's the hope that you will change your how you respond to the Shema. This way, at least you start off doing a mitzvah, and then as you grow in that mitzvah of doing it, maybe you too will transform in your process.
Okay, that's wonderful. So then that makes some sense also of the two Mishnayot, which seem to be suggesting different things. One is talking about a bare minimum, which is just make sure that you're present in saying it. And then another one's talking about an ideal. Like maybe you can get to the point where you're actually accepting the kingship of heaven upon you. But there's a process in there. Pam?
That's such a good point, and I'm really glad you said that, because we all come to the table from a different place, and even in a different day, like we could have a distraction, and so just to that we're at different places. But I also think that not all mitzvot are equal. So the idea of something that's for another person, like, you know, showing up for someone who's sick, showing up at a funeral, showing, you know, those types of things. It doesn't matter what your kavanah is, just do it. Just show up, right? Because if it's like between you and another person, you just do the right thing, right? And if it's between you and God, it sounds to me like your kavanah would be more important in that case.
Great. Thank you for that. What a smart and important final position here, which is that there are mitzvot which require kavanah and mitzvot which do not. Right? Like there are mitzvot which seem to fear the Lord your God, love the Lord your God. The Shema is about loving the Lord your God. Of course that has to do with what's going on inside of you, right? Like, why did the Gemara so quickly turn it into all mitzvot need intention when they were talking about something that was really about, right, as Tali said, b'chol levavcha, your heart. I don't require you to have any intention in not murdering, just don't do it, right? Like, who cares what you brought to the table? There's some that are about action. So we're at time, so I'll leave it there. But I think, Pam, that's a very important sort of like conclusion and suggestion for where we might go from here in thinking about kavanah. Thanks, everybody. Good to be learning with you, and see you tomorrow at noon if you wish. We'll be studying the parsha together. Bye.
Thank you.
I'll stay on if anyone has any other questions.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Anyone else? Alexandra, I see you have a question.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm so glad I was able to make this class because it's a topic I've actually been wondering a lot about. And like that question that I had before about like the rabbis adding that into the Shema where it's not in the Torah. And I was just wondering more about that process and when that happened exactly and why and what was going on in the climate, because I actually find it so disturbing and almost heartbreaking that my whole life, like I was told to say this Shema and I never connected with it until someone from a different religion told me about their oneness and loving God mantra, and I was like, where is it in my religion? And I found it, but I didn't know that this sentence was actually not in the Torah. That separated me from God and separated me from loving God is how I feel about that sentence. So I just wanted to know more. Like,
which sentence? Blessed is the kingship of God forever and ever. Is the name of the
kingship? Yeah, it feels like it takes out of the rhythm, out of the like the connection with God and love, and like it feels like it's removing me from that, and I almost feel betrayed, like, and I just want to know more about how that happened. What am I missing? Why was that added there?
Okay, I'm going to give a quick answer, but it's an answer.
Thank you.
That is the Talmud. In some ways, is the whole answer to your question. In other words, how does this happen? When does this happen? That's what the Talmud is up to. That's what the Talmud is busy doing. Is like, well, what about this? What about this? We should do this. Like, can there be breaks between it? Like, a lot of the discussion that's in the Talmud is the formulation of what becomes the liturgy. In terms of the sentence that you're talking about, I think that there's an actual story, like a midrashic story, that says that on his deathbed, Jacob said to his sons, Shema Yisrael, and it has extra resonance because it's like, listen to Israel, listen to your father, right? So it's like, it becomes a kind of communication. And they respond, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. In other words, they're saying, absolutely, we are present, we get it. Like, are you accepting the kingship of heaven? Yes, we are accepting you can see, by the way, how Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, the kingship of heaven concept is in there. So, right, so the rabbis also have some idea that that's what it's about. But I think that honestly, the simplest, most straightforward answer to your question is that though Shema, the first paragraph, is a paragraph, in some respects, we sort of, we feel the first line to have an existence onto itself. Like just Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad is like it's a mantra, right? It's our credo. So to just flow from that into the rest of the paragraph, I think felt to the rabbis like, well, we're not giving the Shema its due. Let's pause there, respond to it, as Jacob's sons once said. And you may not like the response, but I think the idea is like, let's separate out that first line and just make it a full, and that's why we say Shema Yisrael. Like that's why we go through that, because that line has been taken to have like a kind of significance unto itself. And by the way, for those still on the call, we'll end with this thought. There is a huge debate, discussion, as I said, in the Talmud over how much of the Shema one has to have intention for, right? Because they say, oh, you require intention, but then they say, well, can you possibly maintain intention throughout all of these 3 paragraphs? And they end up concluding that you have to at least have intention for the first line. So that again gives the first line a kind of status unto itself. It's like, be fully present for that line, and then there's like a little break, and then we move on. So that's like a little bit about how it happens. But sorry they picked the line that doesn't work for you at all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. All right, goodbye everyone.